A homeless widow saved the life of a millionaire who was drowning in the river and gave her own life in his place. When the widow took her last breath, the millionaire begged her to stay alive. The rain fell mercilessly on the sleeping city, transforming streets into turbulent rivers and the night into a mantle of ruthless darkness. Under the old bridge, in the forgotten outskirts where few dared to pass even during daylight, Catherine hugged little Gabriel against her thin chest, trying to protect him from the cutting cold that penetrated to the bone. The boy coughed incessantly, and each cough worried Catherine even more. She herself trembled violently, not only from the cold of the storm that lashed at the night, but from the fever that had been burning her body for 2 days, making her vision oscillate between moments of clarity and waves of suffocating dizziness. Gabriel's lips were pale, and his little brown eyes were tearful, seeking some comfort in Catherine's face while the rain thundered outside like a wild animal, trying to invade the only refuge they had. Catherine held the last piece of bread she had saved in an old plastic bag, already wet and crumpled, and broke it in half with trembling hands, offering the larger portion to Gabriel. "Eat, my angel, you need to eat something," she said, her voice coming out weak and hoarse, carrying a desperate tenderness that hurt in her chest. Gabriel took the soaked piece of bread and bit slowly but soon stopped, interrupted by another coughing fit that shook his entire little body. Catherine felt tears burning her eyes as she watched the boy suffer, and her free hand dived into the torn pocket of her old coat, searching for the only treasure she still possessed, a crumpled and faded photo of her late husband. The image was so worn by time and tears that it was almost impossible to distinguish the details of his face, but Catherine didn't need to see clearly to remember each feature, each smile, each promise they had made to one another before life brutally separated them. She pressed the photo against her chest forcefully, as if she could extract from it some strength she no longer had, some courage that was fading with each minute that passed on that cold and damp bridge. The noise of the storm grew outside. The lightning briefly illuminated the dark space where they tried to shelter, and Catherine could see the puddles forming on the uneven concrete floor, slowly advancing toward them as if nature itself conspired to expel them from that last refuge. Gabriel coughed again, stronger this time, and Catherine felt her heart tighten with real physical pain, an anguish that went far beyond the discomfort of the fever consuming her strength. "I promised I would be strong," she whispered to the photo, her words coming out broken, barely audible amid the noise of the rain. "But I don't know if I can anymore." The tears finally ran down her face, mixing with the moisture that already covered her icy skin. The sound of shuffling footsteps on the wet concrete made Catherine quickly look up, her body tense with protective instinct, ready to place herself between Gabriel and any danger that might appear. But it was just old Mary, the elderly woman who also lived under that bridge, sharing the same cruel fate of abandonment and misery. Mary's face was marked by deep wrinkles that told stories of a difficult life. Her disheveled and wet grey hair stuck to her forehead, and she carried with her some pieces of cardboard she had found to try to block the icy wind that entered through the sides of the bridge. She approached slowly, her tired eyes still capable of expressing genuine concern, as she observed Catherine and Gabriel huddled together, looking as fragile and vulnerable as dry leaves being carried away by the storm. Mary knelt beside them with difficulty, her joints complaining of the movement, and extended her hand to touch Catherine's forehead. The touch was brief, but enough to make the elderly woman widen her eyes with alarm. "Catherine, you're burning with fever," said Mary, her rough voice carrying a tone of maternal disapproval mixed with real fear. "You can't go out in this rain." Catherine weakly shook her head, trying to push Mary's hand away, but her movements were slow and uncoordinated, revealing how debilitated she was. "I need to go, Mary," replied Catherine, forcing her voice to sound firmer than she actually felt, while her fingers protectively squeezed Gabriel's shoulder. "Gabriel needs medicine urgently." Mary looked at the boy, observing the sickly pallor of his skin, the way his little chest rose and fell with difficulty with each labored breath, and immediately understood the gravity of the situation. She herself had already lost loved ones due to lack of resources for simple treatments. She knew all too well how diseases that could be easily cured became death sentences for those living on the streets, invisible to the eyes of society that hurried past every day without seeing the suffering that happened in the shadows. The elderly woman felt a tightness in her chest, a mixture of helplessness and anger against the injustice of a world that allowed innocent children like Gabriel to suffer that way. "But you can barely stand up," argued Mrs. Mary, pointing to the way Catherine was shaking uncontrollably. "How will you manage to walk around in this storm with this fever?" Catherine bit her lower lip hard, tasting the metallic flavor of blood in her mouth, using the physical pain to stay focused, to not let weakness overcome the determination that pulsed within her like a stubborn flame that refused to be extinguished. "If I don't go now, I won't have another chance," explained Catherine, her voice breaking slightly on the last word, revealing the desperation she was trying to hide. "The free clinic only opens again on Monday. That's 3 days." The information fell like a heavy stone among the 3 people sheltered there, because they all knew what 3 days could mean for a child as sick as Gabriel was. 3 days were an eternity, when each hour could be the difference between life and death, when each cough seemed weaker than the previous one, when a child's eyes began to lose that special brightness that only childhood possesses. Catherine looked at Gabriel again, seeing how he huddled against her, seeking warmth she could barely offer, and felt a wave of fierce determination course through her sick body like a ray of pure energy. She couldn't let him die, not when there was still something she could do, no matter how difficult it was, no matter how impossible it seemed at that moment. "I'll return bottles at the supermarket and look for something I can sell," continued Catherine, already starting to move to get up, though her muscles protested with each movement. "I need to get enough money to buy the medicine at the 24-hour pharmacy." Mrs. Mary held Catherine's arm with surprising strength for someone so fragile, trying to make her reconsider that madness. "You'll die out there with this fever and this storm," said Mrs. Mary? And there was real panic in her voice now, because she was seeing a woman who could barely remain conscious planning to go out to face one of the worst storms they had ever seen in that region. Catherine paused for a moment, looking at the elderly woman who showed more concern for her than many people who claimed to be family in the past. She knew Mrs. Mary was right, that the chances of getting somewhere and coming back alive were very small, considering her physical state. But she also knew that staying there, protected and warm, would mean watching Gabriel get worse, hour after hour, without being able to do absolutely nothing. And that prospect was infinitely more terrifying than any storm nature could throw at her. Catherine took a deep breath, feeling her lungs burn with the effort, and covered Mrs. Mary's hand with her own, squeezing it gently. "If I don't get this money today, Gabriel might die," said Catherine, and her voice was firm now, carrying an absolute certainty that left no room for arguments. "He's only 5 years old." The words hung in the damp air between them, heavy as lead, carrying all the urgency and all the desperation of an impossible situation that demanded an equally impossible choice. "Mrs. Mary slowly released Catherine's arm, defeated by the cruel logic of that reality, and merely nodded in silent agreement. Catherine turned to Gabriel, who was watching her with those big, innocent eyes, not fully understanding what was happening, but instinctively feeling that something important was about to change. She knelt in front of him, ignoring the dizziness that threatened to knock her down, and held the boy's pale little face between her cold hands. "You're going to stay here with Mrs. Mary, okay," said Catherine, trying to smile at him even though she felt like crying. "I'll be back soon with the medicine that will make you better." Gabriel stared at her for a long moment, processing the information with the seriousness of someone who had learned far too early that the world was a difficult and scary place. He didn't want Catherine to leave. She was the only person who treated him with true affection in that hostile world, the only one who made him feel that there was still something good amid so much pain and abandonment. But he also trusted her completely, with that unwavering faith that only children possess. And if she said she needed to go, then he would accept it, even without fully understanding. "Do you promise you'll come back?" asked Gabriel, his tiny voice barely managing to escape between the coughs that still shook his small body. Catherine felt tears threatening to overflow again, but held them back through pure willpower. "I promise, my angel," Catherine replied, and sealed the promise with a lingering kiss on the boy's hot forehead, trying to engrave in her memory that sensation of having someone to care for, someone who depended on her and gave purpose to her difficult days. She forced herself to stand up, each movement a battle against her own body that begged for rest, and looked at Donna Mary with an expression that mixed gratitude and silent plea. "Donna Mary, please take care of Gabriel for a few hours," said Catherine, her voice trembling slightly, despite her effort to keep it steady. "Keep him warm, and if he gets much worse..." She couldn't finish the sentence because she couldn't bear to think of the possibility of not returning in time, of leaving Gabriel alone precisely when he needed her most. Donna Mary understood what Catherine couldn't say and nodded, already moving to sit beside Gabriel and wrapping him with the pieces of cardboard she had brought, creating a fragile but better-than-nothing barrier against the relentless cold. "I'll take care of him as if he were my own grandson," promised Donna Mary, and there was so much weight in those words that Catherine felt some of the tension in her shoulders diminish, knowing that Gabriel would be as safe as possible in the terrible circumstances in which they lived. Catherine took the old torn plastic bag she used to carry the few things she owned, checked if there were still some empty bottles she had saved in the last few days, and walked toward the edge of the protection the bridge offered. The rain fell like a solid curtain of water just a few steps away, and Catherine could feel the icy wind lashing her face even before completely leaving the protection of the concrete. She looked back one last time, seeing Gabriel huddled in Donna Mary's arms, his little eyes fixed on her with a mixture of fear and hope that broke Catherine's heart into 1,000 pieces. She reached into her pocket and touched the crumpled photo of her husband once more, as if that gesture could give her the strength necessary for what she was about to do. "Help me come back to him," Catherine whispered to the photo, to the memory, to any higher power that might be listening on that terrible night. "Don't leave this boy alone." And then, taking a deep breath and gathering all the courage that still remained in her fragile and sick body, Catherine took the first step out from under the protection of the bridge, heading straight into the storm that roared in the darkness of dawn. The rain hit her with the force of 1,000 icy needles piercing her skin, soaking her already damp clothes in a matter of seconds, and the wind almost knocked her down at first, making her dangerously stagger to the side. But Catherine remained standing through sheer willpower, clutched the plastic bag to her chest, and began walking toward the nearest supermarket, gradually disappearing into the merciless darkness of the storm, while each step seemed more difficult than the previous one. The streets were completely deserted, transformed into shallow rivers that ran toward clogged drains, carrying accumulated garbage and debris. Catherine walked slowly, each step a struggle against the dizziness that threatened to knock her down at any moment, against the fever that made her whole body ache as if she had been beaten, against the cold that penetrated to the marrow of her bones, making her teeth chatter uncontrollably. Visibility was almost zero. The streetlights created diffuse halos in the curtain of rain, and Catherine needed to concentrate intensely to not lose her sense of direction amid that liquid darkness that seemed to want to swallow her. She passed closed shops with their metal gates locked, dark alleys from which strange sounds came that made her quicken her pace despite her exhaustion, parked cars that looked like giant sleeping animals at the edge of the sidewalk. Her bare feet stepped on cold and irregular surfaces. Each step was painful, but she continued forward. But Catherine kept walking, stumbling, regaining her balance at the last second, because stopping would mean giving up, and giving up would mean accepting that Gabriel would die for lack of a simple medicine that cost only a few dollars. "Just a few more streets," Catherine repeated to herself like a mantra, her voice being swallowed by the noise of the storm before it even fully left her mouth. "Just a little more, and I'll get there." But her body was reaching its limit. The fever was dangerously rising, and each breath burned her lungs like liquid fire. Catherine turned a corner, holding onto a lamppost to avoid falling, and suddenly her legs simply refused to continue obeying. She felt her knees buckle against her will, the world violently spinning around her as if she had entered a whirlwind, and then she was falling in slow motion while desperately trying to extend her hands to cushion the impact. She hit the ground on her knees on the hard and uneven sidewalk, pain exploding in her legs like fireworks. But worse than the physical pain was the wave of nausea that hit her immediately afterward, rising up her throat like a poisonous wave that could not be contained. Catherine felt her body give in completely. She fell to her knees on the sidewalk, overcome by intense nausea that left her even weaker. She tried to get up, supporting her trembling hands on the cold, rough concrete, but her arms had no more strength. Her muscles simply didn't respond to the desperate commands her brain was sending. The rain continued to fall relentlessly on her, washing away the vomit, but at the same time making her increasingly cold, ever closer to that point of no return where the body simply gives up fighting. Catherine rolled to her side, curling into a fetal position on the wet sidewalk, the plastic bag with the bottles still pressed against her chest as if it were the most precious thing in the world. "I need to get up," she whispered to herself, but the words came out too weak, without conviction, because her body was screaming that it couldn't take any more, that it had reached its absolute limit. Lightning cut across the dark sky above her, briefly illuminating her pale and wet face, her purplish lips, her half-closed eyes struggling to remain conscious. And for a terrible moment, Catherine wondered if this would be her last vision of the world. A cold sidewalk, relentless rain, and the painful certainty of having failed the only person who really needed her. The law firm occupied the 30th floor of one of the most imposing buildings in the city's financial center, with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a spectacular panoramic view of the metropolis that stretched as far as the eye could see. Richard Blackwood was sitting in an Italian leather chair that cost more than many people earned in an entire year, but at that specific moment, he felt absolutely no comfort, no security that luxurious environment normally provided. At 45, Richard had built a real estate empire from scratch, erecting skyscrapers that changed the city's skyline, creating entire neighborhoods where there were once only abandoned lots, and his name was synonymous with success and power in the most exclusive business circles. He wore a custom-made suit that cost more than $5,000, impeccably polished Italian shoes, and a Swiss watch on his wrist worth as much as a luxury car. But as he sat there observing the three lawyers on the other side of the solid mahogany table that stretched between them like a battlefield, Richard felt as if all those material things that had always made him feel safe and powerful were dissolving into the air like smoke. The lawyers had somber expressions etched on their professional faces, and the amount of documents scattered across the table was so large that it seemed to form small mountains of paper that partially blocked the view between them. The lead attorney, a man with graying hair and gold-rimmed glasses whom Richard had known for more than a decade, cleared his throat in a way that indicated he was about to say something extremely unpleasant. "Mr. Blackwood, I need to be direct with you because we don't have much time," said the lawyer, his professional voice trying to maintain a neutral tone, but completely failing to hide the gravity of the situation. Richard leaned forward in his chair, his fingers interlaced on the table, feeling a growing tension in his chest that made each breath a little more difficult. "Your partner Donald has diverted $80 million from the company accounts," the lawyer continued, and his words fell on Richard like hammer blows, each syllable resonating in his head like a distorted echo that refused to make complete sense. Richard blinked several times, processing the information as if he were hearing it in a foreign language he didn't fully master, because this simply couldn't be happening, not with Donald, not with the man who had been his business partner and close friend for more than 20 years. "The accounts are empty," added the lawyer, flipping through some of the documents in front of him as if he needed to confirm what he was saying, although it was obvious that he had already verified those numbers dozens of times before that meeting. Every cent the company had in liquid assets was transferred to offshore accounts over the last 3 months, gradually, and the second lawyer, a middle-aged woman with a severe haircut and an even harsher expression, leaned forward and pointed to a specific pile of documents. "Worse yet, Mr. Blackwood, he forged your signature on illegal contracts," she said, pushing some papers toward Richard. "Contracts with shell companies, agreements that violate various environmental protection and urban zoning laws, documents that commit the company to projects that should never have been approved." Richard picked up one of the documents with hands that were beginning to tremble slightly, observing his own signature there at the bottom of the page, a signature that seemed perfect, but that he was absolutely certain he had never made. "The authorities may initiate a criminal investigation at any moment," added the third lawyer, a young man who seemed uncomfortable having to be there giving such terrible news. "And when that happens, you will be the first to be called to testify, because legally those signatures make you responsible for everything." Richard felt as if the ground was opening up beneath his feet, as if he were falling into a bottomless pit that sucked away all the reality he knew and replaced it with a surreal nightmare from which he couldn't wake up. "This is impossible," Richard exploded, his voice coming out louder than he intended, echoing in the silent office and causing the three lawyers to glance quickly at each other, with expressions that mixed embarrassment and pity. "Donald has been my friend for 20 years. The word friend came out loaded with all the incredulity and despair that Richard felt, because this wasn't just a professional betrayal, it was the complete destruction of decades of trust, of shared moments, of kept secrets, of a partnership that he always believed to be unbreakably solid. Richard remembered all the times he had blindly trusted Donald, how they had started together, when no bank wanted to lend money to two young entrepreneurs with no track record, how they had celebrated each victory together, how Donald had been the best man when Richard married Victoria, how their children called Donald uncle and spent vacations at each other's homes. "I was your friend," corrected the lead lawyer, emphasizing the past tense in a way that made Richard feel a sharp pang in his chest, as if someone had just plunged a knife into his ribs. The lawyer took a deep breath before continuing, preparing to deliver more bad news that clearly weighed on his professional conscience. "He fled abroad this morning, Mr. Blackwood," said the lawyer, checking his notes on a tablet in front of him. "He boarded a private flight to a country with no extradition treaty, taking with him important documents and, presumably, access to the accounts where the money was deposited." Richard closed his eyes for a moment, trying to control the wave of anger and betrayal that threatened to explode inside him like a time bomb that finally reached zero. Donald had not only betrayed him, not only stolen everything they had worked for together, but had planned his escape with a calculated coldness that showed this had not been an impulsive act of desperation, but rather an elaborate scheme executed over months, perhaps even years, while smiling to Richard's face and pretending to be his loyal friend and trusted partner. "And there's more," continued the lawyer, and his tone of voice made it clear that the worst was yet to come, that the bombs that had already exploded were just the beginning of a complete demolition of everything Richard considered solid in his life. The female lawyer took another set of documents and placed them in front of Richard with a delicate movement, almost reverent, as if she were handling something extremely fragile and dangerous. "Your wife, Victoria, filed for divorce yesterday afternoon," she said, her voice professional but not completely devoid of compassion. "She already knew everything and took the assets that were in her name." Richard felt as if he had been punched in the stomach, all the air leaving his lungs at once, leaving him struggling to breathe while processing this new betrayal that somehow hurt even more than the first one. Victoria knew. His wife of 22 years knew what was happening, and not only didn't warn him but took the opportunity to protect her own interests and abandon the sinking ship before it was too late. Richard picked up the divorce petition, with hands that now visibly trembled, reading the formal and cold words that dissolved more than 2 decades of shared history, as if they meant absolutely nothing. Her assets include the country house, 2 of the investment properties that were registered in joint names, but with her as primary owner, and about 15 million in personal investments that she transferred to separate accounts over the past 6 months, explained the lawyer, pointing to a detailed list attached to the divorce petition. Richard felt his head spinning, trying to understand how Victoria had managed to do all of that without him noticing, and then realized with painful clarity that he simply hadn't been paying attention, was too busy building his empire, closing deals, conquering the world, while his own home crumbled around him without him noticing the warning signs that were probably always there. "She knew all along," Richard muttered, more to himself than to the lawyers, the betrayal burning in his throat like acid. He felt like a complete idiot, a fool who had been deceived by the 2 people he trusted most in the world. Richard dropped the divorce documents on the table as if they burned his hands and grabbed his cell phone from his pocket, with abrupt and desperate movements, needing to hear his children's voices, needing some anchor of normality amid that hurricane of destruction that was swallowing his entire life. He dialed Axel's number, his oldest son of 19 who was in his 2nd year of college studying architecture, to eventually join the family business, but the call went straight to voicemail without even ringing. Richard hung up and immediately dialed Samantha, his 17-year-old daughter who had always been Daddy's little girl, the girl who used to wait for him at the door even when he came home late at night. but the result was exactly the same. Immediate voicemail, as if the phone was turned off or she had blocked his number. He tried once more with Axel, then with Samantha again, and then with increasing desperation dialed Victoria's number, his wife, who apparently was no longer his wife in any sense that mattered. The automated voice of the operator informed him that number was not available, and Richard understood, with an icy shock running down his spine, that Victoria had blocked his number, completely cutting off any possibility of communication. "They're not answering," said Richard, and his voice came out broken, vulnerable in a way he hadn't allowed himself to be for many years, decades perhaps, since the difficult times when he was starting out, and each rejection was an open wound in his determination. The three lawyers looked at each other again, and Richard realized they already knew this would happen, already expected that his family would abandon him in that moment of crisis, and that perception made something inside him crack even more deeply. "My wife blocked my number," continued Richard, letting the cell phone fall onto the table with a dull sound that seemed to echo in the heavy silence that settled in the office. He looked out the huge window, watching the city that stretched below. Thousands of lights beginning to turn on as the afternoon advanced into early evening, and suddenly all of it seemed completely strange and distant, as if he were looking at a place that was no longer part of his reality. The lead attorney cleared his throat again, clearly uncomfortable, but determined to finish delivering all the bad news at once, like a doctor who needs to reveal a terminal diagnosis and wants to get that painful task over with quickly. "Mr. Blackwood, I need you to understand the complete gravity of the situation," he said, gathering some of the scattered documents and organizing them in a specific order that clearly followed some logic that only he understood. "In 48 hours, the creditors will take everything that still remains in the company's name." Richard turned abruptly to face him, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock and indignation that quickly transformed into pure despair when he realized the lawyer was completely serious. "Everything means literally everything," the lawyer continued, his voice adopting that professorial tone people use when they need to explain something extremely complex and important. "The buildings under construction, the undeveloped lands, the offices, the equipment, even the penthouse where you currently live because it's registered as a company asset for tax benefit purposes." The female lawyer added her own contribution to the growing list of disasters. "Your reputation is destroyed, Mr. Blackwood," she said, and there was something almost like pity in her voice now. "The press already knows everything. Donald or someone from his team leaked the story to the main financial newspapers, and by now there must be at least 5 different articles online describing the collapse of your company and speculating about your involvement in the fraud." Richard felt his stomach turn, imagining the headlines, imagining his competitors reading those news with barely disguised satisfaction, imagining all the businessmen who used to greet him with respect now turning their faces away when they saw him on the street. "And there's a criminal investigation being prepared on suspicion of involvement in the fraud," completed the third lawyer, nervously flipping through his own documents. "The public prosecutor is reviewing all contracts signed in the last 3 years, and although your signatures are forged, it will be extremely difficult to prove that without extensive forensic analysis that could take months or even years." Richard felt as if he were trapped in a nightmare from which he couldn't wake up. Each new piece of information worse than the previous one, each revelation destroying another piece of the world he had built so carefully over decades of tireless work. "So you're telling me I've lost everything?" said Richard. And it wasn't really a question, but a bitter realization that needed to be verbalized so it could become real, so he could begin to process the magnitude of the complete collapse of his life. The 3 lawyers nodded slowly, synchronized as if they had rehearsed that moment, and the silence that followed was so heavy and oppressive that Richard found it difficult to breathe, as if the air had become too dense to enter his lungs. "I've lost my company, my fortune, my reputation, my family," Richard continued, enumerating each loss as if taking inventory of his own destruction, his voice becoming progressively lower and emptier with each item on the list. He stood up from the chair abruptly, the movement so sudden that it made the lawyers flinch slightly, and walked to the huge window, placing his hands against the cold glass and observing the city below with an expression that mixed incomprehension and a kind of muted despair. "I helped build this city," said Richard, his voice coming out as a harsh whisper that the lawyers could barely hear. "That building there, that one across, that residential complex, I built all of them, put my sweat and soul into every project." He pointed to different parts of the urban landscape, identifying his works like an artist pointing to his paintings in a gallery. But now each building seemed like a monument to his own fall, physical reminders of everything he had achieved and that would now be taken from him. "And now all of this means absolutely nothing," Richard completed, letting his hands fall to his sides in a gesture of complete defeat that was painful to observe. The lead lawyer stood up too, carefully approaching Richard as if dealing with someone very fragile who could break at any moment. "Mr. Blackwood, I know it seems impossible right now, but there are legal paths we can explore," said the lawyer, trying to offer some hope, even knowing it would be a very tenuous and distant hope. "We can try to track the money, file international lawsuits, work with authorities from other countries to try to bring Donald back." Richard turned to face him, and the expression on his face made the lawyer take an involuntary step back, because there was something broken there, something fundamental that had shattered inside Richard, and that no legal process or corporate strategy could fix. "How long would that take?" asked Richard, although he already knew the answer just by looking at the lawyer's embarrassed face. The man hesitated, clearly not wanting to admit the truth, but also unable to lie to his client. "Years, Mr. Blackwood," the lawyer finally answered. "Probably many years, and even then the chances of recovering anything significant are very small. Donald clearly planned this with extreme care." Richard laughed, but it was a sound completely devoid of humor, a bitter and broken sound that made the three lawyers feel extremely uncomfortable in their expensive clothes and their luxurious offices. "Years," repeated Richard, tasting the word as if it were poison. "Meanwhile, I will be bankrupt, possibly in prison, definitely destroyed." He shook his head slowly, an expression of terrible understanding taking over his tired features. "Thank you for your services," said Richard, and his voice was strangely calm now, a dangerous calmness that worried the lawyers more than the previous despair. "Send the final bill to whatever remains of the assets before the creditors take everything." The lawyers tried to protest, tried to convince him to stay and discuss options, but Richard was already moving toward the door, picking up his coat from the rack with mechanical and automated movements, like a robot executing a program without really being present. Richard left the office without looking back, ignoring the lawyer's attempts to call him back, walking down the luxurious corridor with its Persian rugs and original artwork hanging on the walls as if none of it really existed. He entered the elevator and pressed the button for the penthouse floor where his apartment was located, watching the digital numbers change as the cabin silently ascended. And during all that time, he felt absolutely nothing, as if all his emotions had been burned away, and all that remained was a grey and cold emptiness where once there had been a complete person. The elevator doors opened directly into the private hall of his penthouse, and Richard took the first step into his apartment, already expecting to find the space empty. But even so, the shock of what he saw hit him like a physical punch to the stomach. The apartment was completely stripped, every piece of furniture removed, every decoration torn from the walls leaving lighter marks on the paint where they had hung for years, every rug and every lamp and every personal object simply gone as if they had never existed. The creditors had worked quickly, much faster than Richard had imagined possible, and now he was standing in the middle of an empty space that echoed his steps back to him like an abandoned cave. Richard walked slowly through the empty rooms, his footsteps resonating on the Italian marble floor that had cost a fortune to install, passing through what used to be the living room where his family gathered on the rare nights when everyone was home at the same time, through the dining room where they had hosted some of the most powerful businessmen and politicians in the city for elaborate dinners, through the office where he spent entire. He finally reached what used to be the master bedroom and discovered that the creditors had left only one thing, an old dresser that belonged to Richard's grandmother and had more sentimental than financial value, which was probably why they didn't consider it worth taking. Richard opened the top drawer of the dresser with trembling hands, finding there some things that the creditors had considered not valuable enough to confiscate: old family photos, some old letters, personal documents, and a stack of blank paper along with some pens. He took one of the sheets of paper and a pen, sitting down on the cold floor because there was no longer any chair or bed where he could sit, and began to write with handwriting that was normally firm and decisive, but now came out shaky and irregular. "To my children, who no longer want to hear me," wrote Richard at the top of the page, and had to stop because the tears finally began to fall, blurring his vision and staining the paper with small drops of salt water. He tried to continue writing, tried to find words that could explain how he had reached that point, how the man they knew as a strong and successful father had transformed into that broken person sitting on the floor of an empty apartment. But the words simply wouldn't come, trapped somewhere between his shattered heart and his hand that refused to cooperate. Richard let the pen drop and picked up one of the old photos, a faded image of his family in happier times, Victoria smiling genuinely, Axel and Samantha still children laughing, while Richard held them on his shoulders, all of them at some beach during summer vacation that now seemed to have happened in a completely different life. "How did everything go so wrong?" whispered Richard to the photo, his voice cracked and broken, echoing in the empty apartment. "When did I lose you?" He looked around the sparse space that used to be his sanctuary, his refuge from the world, and realized with painful clarity that he had lost his family long before Donald stole his money, long before Victoria asked for divorce. He had lost them gradually over the years while prioritizing business over family dinners, meetings over school recitals, international conferences over. "I built an empire of lies," Richard said, repeating the words he had thought before, but that now carried even greater weight, and lost everything that truly mattered. He held the photo against his chest, letting the tears fall freely now, and for the first time in many years, Richard Blackwood allowed himself to truly feel the enormity of everything he had lost. Richard didn't know how long he sat there on the cold floor, embracing that old photo, while daylight gradually disappeared through the enormous windows and the city outside began to light up its nighttime lights. Eventually, he forced himself to stand up, his joints protesting after so much time in the same position, and walked to the balcony that extended along the entire side of the apartment, offering a 360-degree view of the illuminated city. The night wind was cold against his face, carrying with it the distant sounds of traffic and life happening below, millions of people living their lives completely unaware that an empire had crumbled on that 30th floor. Richard leaned on the glass parapet, looking down and seeing the car lights moving like luminous rivers through the avenues, and for a terrible and tempting moment, he wondered what it would be like to simply leave all that behind, to simply stop fighting against a tide that had clearly already completely defeated him. He closed his eyes, breathing deeply the cold night air, and when he opened them again, he went back inside the empty apartment with slow and heavy steps. Richard picked up the coat he had dropped on the marble floor, putting it on with mechanical movements, while his mind seemed to be far away from there, processing thoughts that he himself could not or did not want to fully identify. He tucked the family photo into the inner pocket of his coat, pressing it against his chest, as if that piece of paper could somehow protect him from the emptiness that threatened to swallow him completely. "There is nothing left here for me," Richard said to the empty apartment, and his voice echoed back to him, confirming that terrible truth. He walked toward the door with a look that had become completely empty and distant, an expression that anyone who knew him would recognize as dangerous, like the look of someone who has already made a decision from which he does not intend to turn back, and left the penthouse that was no longer his, leaving the door open behind him because it no longer mattered. None of it mattered anymore when everything had already been lost. Catherine had managed to survive the storm that almost left her unconscious on that soaked sidewalk, dragging herself back to consciousness through sheer willpower and the desperate memory of Gabriel waiting for her under the bridge. She didn't know how long she had been lying there, with the rain hammering her already weakened body, but eventually she gathered enough strength to get up unsteadily and continue her impossible journey through the deserted streets of the city. Now, at the end of that afternoon that seemed to last an eternity, Catherine had finally reached the muddy riverbank, but she was practically unrecognizable compared to the woman who had left under the bridge hours before. Her clothes were completely soaked and torn in several places, stuck to her thin body in a way that made every movement painful and difficult. Her lips were purple from cold, and she was shaking violently. Hypothermia had already set in her fragile body that she didn't even notice anymore. Her hair was stuck to her face in disheveled strands. Her bare feet were cut and hurt from walking on rough surfaces, and there was an expression in her eyes that mixed fierce determination with an exhaustion so deep that it seemed to go beyond the physical and touch something fundamental in her soul. The torn plastic bag she carried hanging on her shoulder contained some empty bottles she had found in trash cans during her tortuous walk, some pieces of metal that someone had discarded and that she might be able to sell for a few cents, and a crushed can that shone in the dim light of a lamppost and caught her attention. "Just $10 more," Catherine whispered to herself, her voice coming out hoarse and broken, as if it hadn't been used for days. "Just 10 more, and I can get Gabriel's medicine." As she repeated those words like a mantra that kept her moving, like a sacred promise that couldn't be broken, no matter the personal cost. The riverbank was a desolate and forgotten place, full of accumulated garbage and wild vegetation that grew uncontrolled among piles of rubble and debris that the current had brought over the years. A dense fog was beginning to form over the dark waters of the river, creating a ghostly atmosphere that made the place seem even more isolated and dangerous than it really was. The old bridge that crossed the river a few meters above where Catherine stood was a structure of rusted metal that had been built decades ago and was now abandoned, considered unsafe for vehicle traffic, but still occasionally used by desperate pedestrians who needed to cross to the other side of the city. Catherine walked along the bank with uncertain steps, searching among the accumulated trash for more bottles or objects she could collect, each movement costing her an immense effort that left her vision blurry and her breathing even more labored. She leaned down to pick up a bottle she saw half buried in the mud, but the movement made her head spin violently, and she had to support herself on a large rock to avoid falling completely. "Just a little more," Catherine murmured, squeezing her eyes shut and trying to control the nausea that threatened to overwhelm her again. "Gabriel is waiting. I promised I would come back." The mental image of the boy coughing and shivering with cold under the bridge was the only thing that still kept her functioning when her body should have given up long ago. Catherine opened her eyes again, forcing herself to focus on the task ahead, and it was then that she saw something that made her stop completely in her tracks. On the old bridge above her, partially obscured by the growing fog but still visible in the faint light of late afternoon, was the silhouette of a man standing completely motionless at the edge of the metal structure. Catherine blinked several times, thinking it might be a hallucination caused by the fever that still burned in her veins, but the figure remained there, solid and real, and as Catherine watched with growing concern, she was able to distinguish more details. The man wore an elegant suit that even at a distance and through the fog seemed expensive and well-tailored, completely out of place in that degraded and abandoned environment. He was standing dangerously close to the edge of the bridge, his arms hanging loosely at his sides, in a posture that suggested total lack of muscle tension, as if he were a rag doll that someone had positioned there and forgotten. But most alarming was the way he was staring fixedly at the churning waters of the river below, with an intensity and focus that completely excluded the rest of the world around him. Catherine felt a tightness in her chest that had nothing to do with her debilitated physical condition, because she recognized that posture, that distant and empty gaze, had seen people in that same position before in the streets where she lived, people who were in a moment of profound hopelessness. "Sir?" Catherine tried to shout, but her voice came out too weak, barely more than a harsh whisper that was immediately swallowed by the noise of the river and wind. "Sir, get away from there!" She cleared her painful throat and tried again, this time putting all the strength she still possessed in her vocal cords. "Sir, get away from there. It's dangerous!" Catherine shouted, her voice echoing along the deserted bank and rising up to the old bridge where the man remained motionless. For a terrible moment, Catherine thought he hadn't heard, that her voice simply hadn't been strong enough to reach him through the distance and fog. But she was wrong. What was worse was that he had clearly heard her and simply chose not to respond, not to react, not to give any sign that her words meant anything to him. Richard had been on the bridge for longer than he could specify, the hours since he had left his empty penthouse blending into a mental fog that mirrored the physical fog that now surrounded the river below him. He had walked through the city streets with no conscious destination, his feet automatically taking him away from the financial center with its gleaming buildings and toward the older and forgotten areas of the periphery. Eventually he had found that abandoned bridge, and something in that desolate and isolated place had resonated with the emptiness he felt within himself. Richard looked at the dark waters flowing rapidly below, observing how the current formed whirlpools and spirals around the stones and debris, and for the first time in many hours, he wasn't thinking about Donald or Victoria, or his children, or his lost company. His mind was strangely silent, as if all the tumultuous thoughts that had dominated his consciousness since that terrible meeting at the lawyer's office had finally exhausted themselves, leaving only a cold, grey emptiness where once there was a complete person with plans and ambitions and fears. He heard a distant voice shouting something, the words reaching him through the fog as if they came from very far away, or from underwater. But they meant nothing. They didn't reach him in the empty place where his mind had taken refuge. "Nothing matters anymore," Richard murmured to himself, his words carried away by the cold wind blowing across the old bridge. Everything has already been lost. He leaned slightly forward, looking at the water below with a strange fascination, as if trying to see something beyond the dark waves, and his foot slipped slightly on the rusty, wet metal of the bridge, making him lose his balance for a frightening moment. Catherine watched with a heavy heart from the riverbank as the man on the bridge leaned further and further forward, his body beginning to lose balance in a way that left no doubt about the danger of the situation. She dropped her bag with the bottles and collected items, not even thinking about the money they represented, or Gabriel's medicine that she still needed to get, because at that moment, all she could see was a human being in danger, a life about to be wasted, and something deep and fundamental in her nature simply wouldn't allow her to stand by and watch it happen. "No, no, no," Catherine repeated as she began moving toward the bridge, her bare and injured feet slipping in the mud and on the stones of the bank, but continuing anyway. "Please don't do this." She wasn't thinking rationally, wasn't considering that her body was on the verge of total collapse, that she could barely stand, let alone climb up to that bridge and help a man who was clearly in a very dangerous situation. All Catherine knew was that she couldn't simply stand there and watch someone in danger, not when there was still a chance, however small, to do something to help. But then, before Catherine could even get close to the base of the bridge, the man completely lost his balance on the slippery metal. His foot had slid too far, and he simply couldn't hold on. And suddenly, he was falling, his body turning in the air as he plummeted from the 5-meter height that separated the bridge from the agitated surface of the river. "My God," whispered Catherine, paralyzed for a second of pure horror as she watched the man hit the water with an impact that produced a dull sound even at a distance. The dark water of the river closed over him immediately, the strong current pulling him down and carrying his body like a piece of driftwood. And for a terrifying moment, it seemed that he would simply disappear under the waters and never return to the surface. But then the man's head briefly emerged above the turbulent surface, his arms flailing awkwardly as he instinctively tried to stay afloat, and Catherine realized with an icy shock that he was drowning, that he was fighting to survive with the desperation of someone who suddenly realized he was in real danger. There was no time to think, no time to consider the consequences or assess her own chances. There was only the pure and urgent instinct to try to save that life that was slipping away with each passing second. Catherine didn't hesitate a moment longer, throwing herself from the muddy bank straight into the icy waters of the river, with no consideration for the fact that she herself was severely weakened by fever and exhaustion, that her chances of managing to swim in that brutal current were minimal, that she was probably putting her own life at risk by doing this. The shock of the freezing water against her body, overheated by fever, was so intense that Catherine almost fainted immediately, every nerve ending in her skin, screaming in protest against that temperature that seemed impossible to be real. The current grabbed her instantly, pulling her down and spinning her body as if it were a toy in the hand of a mischievous child. And for a moment of absolute panic, Catherine thought she had made a terrible mistake, that she wouldn't be able to help anyone and would only make the situation worse. "No," Catherine screamed in her mind, because she didn't have enough air in her lungs to scream out loud. "I cannot give up now, not like this." She forced her arms to move, her legs to kick, fighting against the water that tried to pull her to the bottom with a force that seemed to have its own will and malicious intent. And somehow, Through some reserve of strength that she didn't know she possessed, Catherine managed to keep her head above the surface and begin to swim in the direction where she had seen the man disappear. The current was absolutely brutal, much worse than Catherine had imagined from the shore, each wave seeming to have invisible hands that grabbed her and tried to drag her under the surface. Her already exhausted muscles screamed in agony with each stroke, her lungs burned as if they were filled with acid instead of air, and her vision was blurred by water constantly entering her eyes and by the fever that made everything seem unreal and distorted. But Catherine kept swimming, driven by something much greater than her individual will, something that came from a deep place in her soul where the fundamental goodness that defined who she really was resided. She saw the man's head emerge again a few meters ahead of her, heard the sound of him coughing and choking as he desperately tried to pull air into his water-filled lungs, and that sound gave Catherine the direction and purpose she needed. "Hang in there," Catherine muttered, though the man obviously couldn't hear her. "I'm coming." She swam with renewed strength, closing the distance between them stroke by painful stroke, until she finally managed to reach him and grab the collar of his elegant suit that was now completely soaked and heavy as lead. The man was in total panic, his movements uncoordinated and dangerous as he thrashed in the water, and Catherine had to use all her remaining strength to prevent him from pulling her down along with him. "Hold on to me," Catherine shouted directly into his ear, her voice barely able to penetrate through the sound of the water and the panic that dominated the man's mind. "I'll get you out of here." She managed to rotate her body in the water, positioning herself behind him in a way that gave her more control, and then began to swim with just one arm, while the other held the man against her, pulling him toward the shore that seemed to be miles away, though it was probably just a few dozen meters. Each meter gained was a victory achieved through pure suffering. Each stroke cost Catherine more than she really had to give, and she knew with absolute certainty that she was using the last reserves of energy her body possessed, burning the candle not just at both ends, but in the middle too. But Catherine didn't stop, couldn't stop, because stopping meant leaving that man in danger, and after all she had lost in her life, after all the times she had been powerless to save the people she loved, she simply couldn't accept being powerless once again. She felt when her foot touched something solid under the water, a large rock or perhaps a piece of broken concrete that had fallen on the bank, and used that as support to give one last desperate push, throwing the man with all the strength she still possessed toward the shallower shore. He fell face down in the mud and stones at the edge of the river, coughing violently and vomiting water, but alive, definitely alive and out of immediate danger, and Catherine felt a wave of relief so intense it almost made her faint right there in the water. "You're safe," whispered Catherine, her words being carried away by the current that now pulled her back with renewed force, as if it were angry for having lost one prey and was determined not to lose the second. "You're going to be okay." But as those words left her mouth, Catherine realized with terrible clarity that she herself was not okay, that she had used absolutely everything she had to save that stranger, and now nothing remained. No strength, no energy, no ability to fight against the water that pulled her back toward the center of the river, where the current was strongest and most dangerous. Her arms simply no longer responded to the commands her brain sent. Her legs stopped kicking, and Catherine felt her body begin to sink slowly into the dark, icy water that suddenly didn't seem so terrible anymore, almost inviting in its promise of final rest after so much effort. Richard was lying on the muddy bank, coughing and spitting water, his whole body shaking uncontrollably, not just from the cold, but from the shock of having been so close to danger and suddenly being safe again. His mind was confused, trying to process what had just happened, trying to understand who had pulled him from the water and how he had reached that shore when moments before he was sinking and was certain he was in great trouble. He turned his head with difficulty, looking for the person who had saved him, and that's when he saw the woman in the water, her body already partially submerged, being dragged by the current away from the shore and back to the dangerous center of the river. For a surreal moment, Richard simply observed, his brain still working too slowly to process what that sight meant. But then reality hit him like a bolt of painful clarity. That woman had jumped into the water to save him, had risked her own life to pull him to safety, and now she was in danger because of him. "No!" shouted Richard, and that simple word carried all the horror and all the guilt he felt, because he finally understood what had happened, understood that his moment of weakness and hopelessness had put an innocent person in real danger. "No!" "Grab my hand." He stood up, staggering, ignoring the dizziness that threatened to knock him down again, and extended his arm toward the woman with all the desperate strength of someone who is trying to undo a terrible mistake. But she was too far away. The current had already pulled her beyond his reach, and Richard saw her eyes meet his for a brief and infinite second before she disappeared completely beneath the dark waters. What Richard saw in those eyes would haunt him for the rest of his life. There was no fear there, no accusation or anger for him having caused this. There was only a strange peace, a serene acceptance of someone who had done what they considered right and was at peace with the consequences. Richard didn't think, didn't plan, he simply acted on pure instinct and desperation, throwing himself back into the icy waters he had just escaped. The current grabbed him immediately, but this time he was prepared. This time he had a purpose that went beyond the desperate emptiness that had led him to that bridge, and he fought against the water with a ferocity that came from somewhere deep inside him that he didn't know still existed. He swam frantically in the direction where he had seen the woman disappear, diving beneath the surface and opening his eyes despite the murky and icy water that burned like liquid fire. For a terrifying moment he saw nothing but darkness and confused shadows, and then he saw her. Her body was trapped in submerged branches a few meters ahead, floating in a way that made Richard's stomach turn because it seemed completely lifeless, completely inert. He swam to her with powerful strokes, grabbed her body with both arms and pulled with all the strength he possessed, freeing her from the branches that held her and carrying her back to the surface. When they finally emerged, Richard gasped for air desperately while holding the woman against his chest. And that's when he realized with growing horror that she wasn't responding. Her lips were blue, her body was completely limp like a wet rag doll. "No, no, no," repeated Richard like a desperate mantra, as he swam back to the shore with strength that came from pure adrenaline and terror. "You can't be like this. I won't let this happen." He reached the shore and dragged her body out of the water, placing her carefully on a relatively flat area of mud and stones, and that's when he really saw her for the first time. A woman too thin, with torn and dirty clothes, bare and injured feet, clearly someone who lived on the streets and had been sick for days, but who had thrown herself into an icy river to save a complete stranger. "Breathe," begged Richard, placing his hands on her chest and starting compressions as he had learned in a first aid course years ago. "Please, breathe." But there was no response, no movement, no sign of consciousness. "You need to wake up," shouted Richard to the universe, to any force that might be listening, his tears finally falling freely for the first time on that terrible day, mixing with the river water that was still running down his face. "I should be lying here, not you." He continued the compressions frantically, counting out loud as he had been taught, pressing hard enough to try to make her heart beat again, but not so much that it would hurt her fragile ribs. Catherine's face was as pale as paper, her lips blue as if they had been painted with ink, and there was absolutely no sign of breathing or consciousness that Richard could detect. He leaned in and blew air into her lungs, desperately trying to provide the oxygen her body could no longer capture on its own, then returned to compressions, then more breathing, establishing a frantic rhythm born of pure desperation and overwhelming guilt. "You can't be like this because of me," Richard whispered between compressions, his voice broken and desperate. "You can't. I don't deserve this sacrifice." The shore around them was completely deserted. There was no one to help, no phone nearby to call an ambulance, just Richard and Catherine's seemingly lifeless body in that forgotten and isolated place where the fog continued to thicken and daylight continued to gradually disappear. Richard kept trying to revive her, his hands moving automatically, even as his mind began to accept the terrible possibility that he had arrived too late, that this extraordinary woman, who had shown more courage and kindness in a few minutes than most people demonstrate in an entire lifetime, had given her all to save someone who couldn't even save himself. The sound of sirens tore through the silent dawn like sharp blades cutting through fabric, echoing through the empty streets, and causing the few windows still illuminated to light up with curiosity and concern. The ambulance advanced at high speed down the deserted avenues, its headlights cutting through the darkness, while inside a desperate battle for life was happening on a narrow stretcher that swayed with every sharp turn the driver made. Catherine was lying there, completely motionless and pale as paper, her small and fragile body looking even smaller under the white sheets that partially covered her. A young paramedic in a blue uniform was leaning over her, his interlaced hands performing rhythmic and continuous cardiac compressions on her chest, counting aloud to maintain the correct rhythm while drops of sweat ran down his forehead despite the cold of dawn. Beside him, a female paramedic with hair tied in a tight bun held an oxygen mask over Catherine's face, squeezing the ventilation bag at regular intervals, trying to force air into lungs that refused to function on their own. Richard was sitting on a small side bench inside the ambulance, soaked from head to toe, his eyes fixed on Catherine's pale face with an intensity that bordered on absolute despair. He was shaking violently, not knowing if it was from the cold of his wet clothes or from the shock of what had happened in the last few hours. But he couldn't stop, his entire body shaking as if having mild convulsions. The paramedic quickly looked at the portable monitor beside the stretcher, checking the vital signs that remained terrifyingly flat, and then shouted to the driver in front, "Severe hypothermia, no heartbeat." The paramedic shouted, his voice carrying urgency, but also a trained professional tone that tried to keep panic under control. "We need to get there now." The driver didn't respond verbally, just accelerated even more, making the ambulance practically fly through the streets while the siren continued its sharp and constant wail. Richard watched every movement of the paramedic team with obsessive attention, memorizing each detail as if he could somehow help just by concentrating enough, as if his willpower could somehow transfer life back into that motionless body on the stretcher. He saw when the paramedic stopped compressions for a brief second to check for a pulse in Catherine's neck, observed the grim expression that crossed the young man's face when he found nothing, watched as he immediately resumed compressions with even more force and determination. The female paramedic exchanged concerned looks with her colleague, a silent communication between professionals who had worked together long enough to understand what the other was thinking without needing words. Richard noticed that exchange of looks and felt his stomach churn with a toxic mixture of fear and guilt that threatened to suffocate him. "She's going to be okay," Richard whispered to himself, more as a desperate prayer than as a statement of fact. She has to be okay. But no one in the ambulance responded, because everyone knew that the situation was extremely serious, that each second that passed without Catherine's heart beating on its own drastically reduced her chances of survival. And even if she survived, each minute without adequate oxygen to the brain increased the chances of permanent and irreversible damage. The ambulance finally arrived at the public hospital, its wheels screeching on the asphalt as it made a tight turn to enter the emergency ramp, and even before it came to a complete stop, the rear doors were already being opened by nurses waiting outside with a hospital stretcher ready. The paramedics worked with practiced efficiency, transferring Catherine from the ambulance stretcher to the hospital stretcher in a fluid and coordinated movement that did not interrupt even for a second the cardiac compressions that the young paramedic continued performing. Richard jumped out of the ambulance behind them, stumbling slightly because his legs were still weak and shaking, but he quickly regained his balance and began to run after the medical team that was already pushing the stretcher at high speed through the hospital's automatic doors. The fluorescent lights of the emergency corridor were too bright after the darkness of early morning, making Richard blink repeatedly while trying to keep pace with the team that moved with practiced urgency through the white, aseptic corridors. They passed other stretchers with patients waiting for care, worried family members sitting in hard plastic chairs, doctors and nurses who quickly moved aside to let them pass, all recognizing the extreme urgency of the situation by the speed with which the team moved and by the continuous sound of cardiac compressions that the paramedics still maintained. "Room 3 is free," shouted a grey-haired nurse who ran alongside the stretcher, holding a clipboard with papers that fluttered with the movement. "Trauma team is already on their way." They abruptly turned right, entering a large room equipped with sophisticated machines, surgical lights hanging from the ceiling, and a team of at least 6 people dressed in hospital gowns who were already positioning themselves around the stretcher before it had even completely stopped moving. "Transfer on 321, commanded the paramedic, and in a synchronized movement they lifted Catherine and placed her on the examination table in the center of the room, the cardiac compressions never stopping for even a fraction of a second during the entire transfer. Richard tried to enter the room behind them, but a nurse intercepted him gently but firmly at the door. "Sir, you cannot enter here now," said the nurse, placing a hand on Richard's chest to prevent him from advancing, her tone professional but not without compassion. "The team needs space to work." Richard looked over her shoulder, seeing through the glass window the frantic scene unfolding inside the emergency room, and felt as if he was being torn away from something vital, as if letting Catherine leave his field of vision was somehow abandoning her when she most needed someone to care. "But I need to be there," protested Richard, his voice coming out broken and desperate. "She has no one else. I'm all she has now." The nurse guided him gently but firmly to a waiting area next to the room, where there were plastic chairs and a large window that allowed observation of what was happening inside without interfering with the work of the medical team. "You can stay here and see everything," explained the nurse, her voice softening a bit as she perceived Richard's emotional state. "But you need to let the doctors work, all right?" Richard did not respond, simply positioning himself in front of the window, his hands resting on the cold glass, while his eyes fixed on the scene on the other side. Inside the emergency room, the team moved with a chaotic but efficient choreography, each person knowing exactly what to do and when to do it. A doctor who seemed to be in charge, a woman in her early 40s with dark hair tied in a low ponytail and an expression of intense concentration, was beside Catherine's head, adjusting the tube they had inserted in her throat to ensure adequate airway. "Continue compressions," ordered the doctor, and a muscular nurse immediately took the paramedic's place, resuming cardiac compressions with precise strength and rhythm. "Prepare defibrillator and administer 1 milligram of epinephrine." Her voice was firm and controlled, the type of voice that comes from years of experience dealing with life or death situations where each decision can mean the difference between saving or losing a patient. A nurse ran to an emergency cart and returned with a syringe filled with medication, quickly inserting it into an intravenous line they had already established in Catherine's arm. Another team member was positioning the defibrillator pads on her chest, applying conductive gel to ensure better contact. The heart monitor on the wall showed a completely flat line, accompanied by that continuous and terrifying sound that all healthcare professionals fear, the sound that indicates a total absence of cardiac activity. Richard watched everything through the glass, his fingers pressing against the cold surface with such force that his knuckles were white, and he could barely breathe from the tension he felt squeezing his chest like a steel vise. He saw when the doctor checked the defibrillator monitor, adjusting the charge, and then looked around at the team. "Everyone clear," she announced, her voice loud and clear, cutting through the buzz of activity in the room. "Defibrillating now." The team instantly moved away from the stretcher, hands raised in the air to show they weren't touching Catherine or any metal surface that could conduct electricity. The doctor pressed the button, and Catherine's body arched slightly with the electric shock that went through her system. But when all eyes turned to the monitor, the line remained flat, the continuous sound persisting without change. "Resume compressions," the doctor ordered immediately, without hesitation or apparent emotion in her voice, though Richard could see a slight tension around her eyes that suggested more concern than she let on. "Prepare second dose of epinephrine." The team returned to work with renewed intensity, but Richard could feel, even through the glass that separated them, that there was a different quality in the air now, a growing sense that perhaps they were fighting a battle they could not win. "Come on, Catherine," Richard whispered against the cold glass, his breath creating a circle of condensation on the surface. "You have to fight. You can't give up now." The minutes dragged on like hours, as the medical team continued working on Catherine, trying every intervention in their arsenal to bring back some sign of life. They applied more electric shocks, administered more medications, adjusted the ventilator forcing air into her lungs, checked and rechecked the intravenous lines, but the monitor stubbornly continued showing that terrifying flat line. Richard saw when the doctor, later he would know her name was Dr. Susan, looked at the clock on the wall, then at the monitor, then at Catherine's pale, motionless face. She closed her eyes for a brief moment, and Richard saw her lips move as if she were having an internal conversation with herself, weighing options, considering possibilities. When she opened her eyes again, there was a sad resignation in her expression that made Richard's heart sink. "How much time has passed?" asked Dr. Susan, her voice still firm, but now carrying a weight that wasn't there before. One of the nurses checked a stopwatch. 18 minutes since they arrived, doctor," he replied, his own voice showing signs of emotional fatigue. 22 minutes total since the first cardiac arrest in the ambulance. Dr. Susan nodded slowly, her eyes traveling over Catherine's body, observing the extreme pallor of her skin, the total absence of any response or movement, and then looked at the numbers on the monitor showing dangerously low body temperature, non-existent oxygen saturation, 0 blood pressure. "She has advanced pneumonia, severe malnutrition, extreme hypothermia," said Dr. Susan, and her voice now carried that professional but sad tone that doctors use when they need to accept the inevitable. Her body can't take anymore. The silence that followed was heavy and dense, each member of the team processing what those words meant, all knowing that the doctor was about to make the most difficult decision that any healthcare professional needs to make. "One more time, doctor," insisted a young nurse who was on the other side of the stretcher, his hands still positioned over Catherine's chest, ready to continue compressions, his voice carrying a mixture of desperate hope and refusal to accept defeat. "We can try one more time." Dr. Susan looked at the young nurse, and there was something maternal and sad in her expression, as if she wanted to protect him from the harsh reality that she had already learned after years in emergency medicine. That sometimes, no matter how hard you try, no matter how many interventions you make, some patients are simply beyond what modern medicine can save. She slowly shook her head, her shoulders falling slightly with the weight of that decision. "It's no use," said Dr. Susan, and although her voice maintained that professional tone, there was a genuine sadness there that showed each loss still affected her even after so many years. "We did everything we could, but she was already in critical condition before arriving here. Her body simply has no more reserves to respond to the treatment." She looked around the room, making eye contact with each team member, giving everyone a moment to process what was about to happen. "I'll record the time," continued Dr. Susan, looking at the clock on the wall once more, her eyes following the movement of the second hand as if she were hypnotized by it. 3:47 in the morning. The words fell into the room like heavy stones thrown into a silent lake, creating waves of sad resignation that spread through each person present. Richard, on the other side of the glass, heard those words through the half-open window and felt as if he had been punched in the stomach with enough force to knock all the air out of his lungs. For a frozen moment in time, Richard simply stood there, unable to process what he had just heard, his brain refusing to accept the reality of those words. But then something inside him broke, an emotional dam he had built over decades of business success, where emotions were seen as weaknesses to be controlled. And suddenly he was moving, pushing the emergency room door with such force that it slammed against the wall with a loud sound that made everyone in the room turn to look in shock. "No!" shouted Richard, his voice echoing off the white walls of the room with an intensity that made several people jump. "You can't give up! She saved me!" A nurse tried to move to intercept him, to get him out of the room before he contaminated the sterile environment or interfered with medical equipment. But Richard passed her before she could reach him. "Sir, you can't be in here," the nurse began. But Richard wasn't listening. He was already beside the stretcher where Catherine was lying, looking at her pale, serene face that seemed almost at peace despite all the turbulence around her. Another team member tried to grab Richard's arm, tried to gently but firmly guide him back out of the room. But Richard broke free from the touch with a sudden movement. "I was giving up on everything," shouted Richard, and now tears were falling freely down his face, his voice breaking with raw emotion that he didn't even know he was capable of feeling, much less expressing in front of strangers. "I was letting it all end." He fell to his knees beside the stretcher, his hands gripping the cold metal of the side, as if it were the only solid thing in a world that had become completely liquid and unstable beneath his feet. "And this woman who has nothing, who was already severely weakened by fever," continued Richard, looking around the room at the shocked faces of the medical team who now watched him with a mixture of embarrassment and growing compassion. She jumped into an icy river to save me." His voice fell to almost a whisper, but a whisper so laden with emotion that it somehow carried more weight than his previous shouts. "You don't understand," said Richard, turning his eyes back to Catherine's face, observing every detail of that woman whom he didn't know, but who had somehow completely changed the course of his life in a matter of minutes. "If she doesn't wake up, I will never forgive myself, never." The silence that followed his words was profound and heavy, each person in the room processing not just the words, but the raw and desperate emotion behind them. Dr. Susan observed Richard with a different expression now, her trained medical eyes seeing beyond the physical symptoms to perceive the real human pain that was unfolding in front of her. She looked at Catherine again, but this time she didn't see just another homeless patient in critical condition. She saw a person who had demonstrated extraordinary courage and kindness, a person someone clearly cared deeply about despite having just met. Dr. Susan approached Richard, placing a gentle hand on his trembling shoulder. "She had no one?" asked the doctor, her voice softened by the genuine compassion she felt, no longer asking the question as a professional, but as a human being trying to understand the complete story. Richard looked up, meeting the doctor's eyes through his tears. "She had a heart that most of us have lost," whispered Richard, his voice so low that Dr. Susan had to lean in to hear, but each word carried immense weight. "She lived on the streets, was very sick, probably hadn't eaten properly for days, but when she saw me in danger, she didn't hesitate for even a second." He pressed his hands against the side of the gurney more firmly, as if he could somehow transfer his own life force to Catherine through the cold metal. "Please," begged Richard, his voice completely breaking now, all pretense of control or dignity abandoned in favor of the most basic and desperate human plea. "Try one more time." He looked around the room, making eye contact with each member of the team, letting them see his raw pain and genuine desperation. "I'll pay anything," continued Richard, the words coming out in a desperate rush. "Transfer her to the best hospital, use the best equipment, bring specialists from wherever necessary. I don't care about the cost." He turned his eyes back to Dr. Susan, holding her gaze with an intensity that conveyed the absolute seriousness of every word. "Just don't give up on her like everyone else has," pleaded Richard, his voice barely more than a whisper now, but somehow filling the entire room with its emotional weight. "She deserves someone who fights for her the same way she fought for me." Dr. Susan remained silent for a long moment, her eyes moving between Richard's desperate face and Catherine's motionless body, clearly waging an internal battle between what her medical training and experience told her was the appropriate course of action and what her human heart wanted to do. She looked at the other team members, reading the expressions on their faces, seeing the same internal struggle reflected in each of their eyes. The young nurse who had asked to try once more was still positioned beside Catherine, his hands hovering above her chest, clearly ready to resume compressions the moment he received permission. Dr. Susan closed her eyes, taking a deep breath, and Richard could see the conflict unfolding behind her closed eyelids. When she opened her eyes again, she had made a decision, and Richard saw something change in her expression, a renewed determination mixed with a cautious hope that wasn't there moments before. "Prepare the advanced ICU," ordered Dr. Susan, and her voice had regained that quality of firm command that everyone in the room recognized and instinctively responded to. "We'll do progressive body warming, use all advanced resuscitation techniques available." She looked directly at the young nurse. "And we'll try a sophisticated extracorporeal membrane oxygenation technique that could keep Catherine's blood oxygenated, even if her heart and lungs weren't functioning properly. One more attempt, but we're going to do it right this time." The team exploded into renewed activity, each person moving with restored purpose and energy, reanimated not just by the doctor's order, but by the story they had just heard, by the raw humanity that Richard had brought into that sterile room. The young nurse immediately resumed cardiac compressions, while other team members rushed to fetch additional equipment and prepare more aggressive medications. Dr. Susan returned to her position at Catherine's head, checking the breathing tube and adjusting the ventilator settings to optimize oxygenation. "Let's increase the room temperature and bring special thermal blankets," she instructed as she worked. We need to warm her gradually but in a controlled manner. Too fast, and we could cause more complications." A nurse disappeared through the door and returned moments later pushing a cart with specialized warming equipment. Richard had moved to the corner of the room, pressed against the wall, giving the team space to work, but keeping his eyes fixed on Catherine, as if his constant gaze could somehow help her fight, hold on, come back. Dr. Susan picked up the defibrillator paddles again, checking the settings and slightly increasing the charge. Her body was in extreme hypothermia, she explained, more to herself than to anyone specific, entering that mode of thinking aloud that many doctors use during complex procedures. A hypothermic heart doesn't respond the same way to standard treatment. We need to warm first and then try again. She looked around, making sure everyone was in position. "Everyone clear," she announced, her voice cutting through the buzz of activity. "Defibrillating now." The team moved away again, and this time Richard saw Dr. Susan press the button with an almost fierce determination, as if she could force Catherine's heart to respond through sheer willpower. Catherine's body arched slightly with the shock, and then all eyes in the room turned to the monitor on the wall, collectively holding their breath while they waited to see if this time would be different. The monitor remained flat, that continuous and terrifying sound filling the room like a sentence. 2 seconds passed, feeling like 2 hours. 3 seconds, and Richard felt his legs begin to weaken. 4 seconds of absolute and deadly silence, where no one in the room dared to breathe or move. All fixed on that monitor, as if they could make it change through pure collective concentration. Richard held his breath completely. The tears that had been falling freely moments before now frozen on his face, crystallized by the absolute fear of what that continuous silence meant. Dr. Susan was looking at the monitor, with an expression that was beginning to transform from determined hope back to sad resignation, her hand moving slowly toward the button that would turn off the defibrillator and officially end the resuscitation attempt. Richard saw that movement and felt as if his own heart was stopping, as if the entire universe was contracting to that single point in time where everything that mattered was about to be decided one way or another. And then, so weak that for a moment everyone thought they had imagined it, came a different sound from the monitor. Beep. A single weak and irregular beep, but definitely there, definitely real. Then another, a little stronger. And then another, establishing a hesitant but undeniably present rhythm. "We have a pulse," shouted the nurse who was monitoring the vital signs, his voice exploding with relief and excitement that he didn't even try to control. Weak but present pulse. The relief that swept through the room was almost tangible. You could feel the tension dissolving in the air like mist under the morning sun, each person releasing breaths they didn't know they were holding, shoulders relaxing, expressions softening from extreme tension to something approaching cautious hope. But Dr. Susan, even allowing herself a small smile of relief, quickly raised a hand to temper the optimism that was beginning to grow in the room. "It's not over yet," she said, her voice firm but carrying a clear warning that everyone needed to hear. "We've brought her heart back, but she's in a deep coma." She looked around the team, making sure everyone understood the continued gravity of the situation. "The next 3 days will determine whether she wakes up and recovers," continued Dr. Susan, moving to check other monitors and adjust medications, "or if she remains in a permanent unresponsive state." The words fell upon the momentary relief like a heavy curtain, reminding everyone that although they had won a battle, the war was still far from over. The team began the process of preparing Catherine for transfer to the ICU, connecting her to more sophisticated monitoring systems, adjusting intravenous lines, checking and rechecking every tube and cable that kept her alive. Richard watched from his corner in the room as they wrapped Catherine in special thermal blankets, as they connected her to a portable machine that would continue monitoring her vital signs during transport, as they transformed her from a person into a critically ill patient surrounded by medical technology on all sides. When they began to move the stretcher toward the door, Richard finally left his corner, following behind like a silent ghost, his eyes never leaving Catherine's pale, motionless face. They moved through the hospital corridors, now less frantic but still with urgent purpose, passing through areas that were beginning to wake with the approach of morning, nurses changing shifts, cleaning crews starting their routines. They entered an elevator that took them to the ICU floor, and when the doors opened, Richard saw a different corridor, quieter, more controlled, with glass doors leading to individual rooms where patients in critical conditions fought their own private battles against illnesses and injuries. They took Catherine to one of those rooms, carefully transferring her to a hospital bed surrounded by even more equipment than there had been in the emergency room. Richard stopped at the door, watching as the team worked, connecting Catherine to permanent monitors, adjusting settings, checking values, writing notes on digital tablets. Dr. Susan eventually left the room, stopping next to Richard at the door. "She's stable for now," said the doctor, her voice professional but not without compassion. "But as I said, the next few days are critical." Richard nodded without taking his eyes off Catherine. "Can I stay with her?" he asked, his voice coming out as a hoarse whisper after so much shouting and crying. Dr. Susan hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "For now, yes," she agreed. "But you need to change out of those wet clothes and warm up too, or you'll end up being my next patient." Richard looked down, realizing for the first time since the river that he was still completely soaked, dripping water onto the clean hospital floor, shivering from cold that was finally beginning to penetrate through the shock and adrenaline. "Are there dry clothes I can use?" Richard asked, not really caring about the answer, but understanding that the doctor was right, that he wouldn't help Catherine at all if he got sick too. Dr. Susan signaled to a nurse who disappeared and returned moments later with simple hospital clothes, light blue cotton pants and shirt that patients and visitors could wear. "You can change in the bathroom over there," the doctor indicated, pointing to a door nearby, "and when you come back you can sit in the chair beside her bed." Richard took the clothes and went to change, moving on autopilot, his body performing the mechanical actions of removing wet clothes and putting on dry ones, while his mind remained fixed on the room next door where Catherine lay connected to machines that kept her body functioning, while she floated somewhere between life and complete absence of consciousness. The soft morning light entered through the beige silk curtains, creating delicate patterns of light and shadow that danced gently on the walls of the private room that looked more like a five-star hotel suite than a hospital environment. Catherine opened her eyes very slowly, blinking several times against the brightness that seemed excessively brilliant after so much time in darkness, her vision gradually adjusting and beginning to focus on the details around her. The ceiling was high and painted a soft, creamy white, with elegant moldings at the edges, and a discreet crystal chandelier in the center that projected small rainbows when the sunlight hit it at just the right angle. There were flowers everywhere, elaborate arrangements of white roses in porcelain vases, fragrant lilies in transparent glass jars, exotic orchids in decorative pots that occupied every available surface, filling the air with a delicate and pleasant fragrance that somehow wasn't cloying. Instrumental music played so softly that Catherine wasn't sure if it was real or if her mind was creating sounds to fill the silence, a gentle piano melody that floated through the room like a gentle breeze. Catherine tried to move her head and felt a stiffness in her muscles, a profound weakness that seemed to have settled into every fiber of her body, as if she had slept for an eternity and her limbs had forgotten how to function properly. She realized she was lying in an extraordinarily comfortable bed, with soft sheets that must have had an absurdly high thread count, light but warm blankets, and pillows that felt like clouds supporting her head. There were tubes connected to her arm, a discreet monitor beside the bed emitting soft and regular beeps, but everything was so different from what she would expect from a hospital that for a surreal moment, Catherine wondered if she had somehow been transported to another world entirely. Where am I?" Catherine murmured, her voice coming out harsh and weak as if it hadn't been used for a long time, the words scratching her dry throat in a way that made her cough slightly. The sound of her voice, however faint it was enough to wake someone who was sleeping in a leather recliner next to her bed. Richard had spent the last 5 days practically living in that recliner, leaving only to use the bathroom or take quick showers in the private bathroom attached to the room, refusing to go home or anywhere else while Catherine remained unconscious. He was wearing wrinkled clothes, his hair was disheveled in a way he would never allow in his previous life as an impeccable executive, and there was a several-day beard growing on his face that gave him a careless but somehow more human appearance. His eyes were red, and surrounded by deep dark circles that testified to nights without proper sleep. Hours spent watching the monitor beside Catherine's bed, as if he could force her to wake up through sheer concentration. The times he had dozed off, only to wake up startled minutes later, checking if she was still breathing. When he heard Catherine's voice, Richard woke up instantly, his eyes opening completely as if he had never been sleeping, and he leaned forward in the armchair so quickly that he almost fell from it. "You're awake," Richard whispered, and there was so much relief and emotion in his voice that it trembled and broke in the middle of the sentence, tears already beginning to form in his tired eyes. "You're back." He rose from the armchair with stiff movements of someone who had spent too much time in an uncomfortable position, but didn't seem to notice or care about the physical discomfort, all his attention completely focused on Catherine as he approached the bed with cautious steps, as if afraid she might disappear again if he moved too quickly or spoke too loudly. Catherine turned her head toward the voice, her eyes finding Richard and blinking in confusion as she tried to process who this man was and why he seemed so emotional and relieved to see her awake. Catherine tried to sit up in bed, her arms trembling with the effort of pushing her body up against the pillows, but the weakness in her muscles was so profound that she barely managed to lift her shoulders a few inches before giving up, frustrated with her own inability to execute such a simple movement. "Gabriel," said Catherine, and suddenly her voice was laden with urgency and growing panic as memories began to return in confused fragments. "Donna Mary, I need to." She couldn't finish the sentence because she didn't know exactly what she needed, only knew there was something important she should be doing, someone who needed her, a promise she had made and needed to keep. Richard immediately extended his hands in a reassuring gesture, moving to the side of the bed and carefully sitting on the edge of the mattress, close enough for Catherine to see him clearly, but not so close as to uncomfortably invade her personal space. "They're fine," Richard said quickly, his voice carrying an urgency to calm Catherine's fears before she became too agitated and potentially harmed her fragile recovery. "I brought them both here." He made a wide gesture with his arm, indicating not just the room but the entire hospital around them. "Gabriel is healed. He took all the medicine he needed, is well fed and resting in a comfortable room," continued Richard, speaking slowly and clearly to ensure Catherine understood every word through the confusion that still clouded her eyes. "Donna Mary is in a room downstairs, also resting and being cared for by the medical staff, receiving treatment for her own conditions that had been neglected for a long time." He gently took Catherine's hand, holding it between his with a delicacy that contrasted with the obvious size and strength of his hands. "Everyone is safe," concluded Richard, his voice softening even more. "You don't need to worry about anything now, just focus on getting better." Catherine looked at their intertwined hands, then at Richard's face, and he could see the processing happening behind her eyes as she tried to fit the pieces of information she was receiving with the fragmented memories that were beginning to emerge from the fog in her mind. Catherine looked around the room again, this time processing the details with more attention, observing the obvious quality of everything surrounding her, the luxury that was so distant from anything she had experienced in her life that it seemed almost unreal. The memories were coming back now in disconnected but increasingly clear flashes. The storm, the bridge, Gabriel coughing, the icy river, a man falling, water in her lungs, darkness. "You," whispered Catherine, her eyes widening as realization began to take shape. "You're the man from the bridge." It wasn't a question but a statement laden with gradual recognition, pieces of a confusing puzzle, finally beginning to fit into a pattern that made some sense. Richard nodded slowly, gently squeezing her hand, his thumb tracing small, comforting circles on the back of her hand in an unconscious gesture of care. "And you're the woman who saved me," replied Richard, his voice thick with emotion. "Twice." Catherine frowned slightly, confusion crossing her pale face as she processed those words. "Twice," she repeated, clearly not understanding what he meant, her mind still working too slowly to make all the necessary connections. Richard took a deep breath, gathering courage to explain something he had been thinking and rethinking during all those days sitting in that armchair, watching Catherine fight for her life without even knowing she was fighting. "Yes," said Richard, and now the tears that had been threatening to fall finally began to stream freely down his face, leaving bright trails on his unshaven cheeks. That night, I was on the bridge that night because I had lost everything. He paused, organizing his thoughts, deciding how much to reveal about the mental state he was in on that terrible night. My company had been destroyed by betrayal. My family had abandoned me. My reputation was in ruins, continued Richard, each word costing a visible emotional effort. I was on the bridge that night because I had lost everything. I felt there was no more hope, that my life no longer had meaning. He deliberately avoided being more specific about what he intended to do on that bridge, aware that there were lines he shouldn't cross in the explanation. I was letting the darkness take me, concluded Richard, his voice dropping to little more than a whisper laden with shame and regret. Catherine listened in silence, her eyes fixed on Richard's face, and he could see tears beginning to form in her own eyes as she processed not just the words, but the deep and real pain behind them. "But then you appeared," continued Richard, and now there was something different in his voice, something approaching reverent admiration mixed with deep gratitude. "You, who were so weakened by fever, with nothing in the world, fighting just to survive one more day." He shook his head slowly, still unable to fully process what he had witnessed. "You jumped into a freezing river to save a complete stranger," said Richard, squeezing her hand a little harder. "A stranger who was giving up on life while you fought for it every second, every breath." He leaned in closer, needing her to fully understand what he was trying to communicate. "When you sank into that water," whispered Richard, his voice breaking again, "when I saw you disappear under the waves after pushing me to safety, something awoke inside me." Tears were falling freely now, dripping from Richard's chin onto the white sheets of the bed. "I realized what I was doing, what I was about to throw away," he continued, the words coming out in a desperate rush of raw emotion that he no longer tried to control. "I realized that while I, with all the resources in the world at my disposal, was wasting my life because of problems that in the end were just material and temporary, you, with absolutely nothing except the clothes on your back, considered life so precious and valuable that you were willing to give yours to save another's." The silence that followed his words was profound and heavy, filled only by the soft sound of the monitor beside the bed and the irregular breathing of both as they processed the magnitude of what had happened between them that night at the river. "I only did what anyone would do," Catherine finally whispered, her voice so low that Richard had to lean in even closer to hear, and there was something genuine in her tone that made it clear that she really believed this, that in her mind it hadn't been anything extraordinary but simply the right and obvious thing to do. Richard shook his head vigorously, refusing to let her minimize what she had done, the sacrifice she had demonstrated. "No," said Richard firmly, holding her gaze with intensity. "That's not true, and you need to understand this." He took a deep breath, preparing to reveal something that Catherine clearly didn't know. "In the hospital you had no vital signs," explained Richard, choosing his words carefully to not be too graphic, but still convey the seriousness of what had happened. "Your heart failed. You weren't breathing. The doctors were ready to give up." Catherine stared at him with wide eyes, processing that information, clearly having no idea how close she had come to never waking up again. "And you know what I did?" asked Richard, though he didn't expect an answer. "I begged Catherine. I knelt on the floor of that emergency room and begged them not to give up on you." His voice was full of raw and uncontrolled emotion now. "Because I realized something in that moment," continued Richard, tears still falling. "I realized that if you didn't survive after saving me, then the wrong person would have been the one who continued to live, and I couldn't live with that. Couldn't look at myself in the mirror knowing that someone so good and brave as you had been lost while someone so lost and selfish as I was at that moment had survived." Silence fell between them again, but this time it was a different silence, charged not only with emotion but with mutual understanding of a deep connection that had formed between two people in extraordinary circumstances. "You showed me something fundamental," said Richard, his voice stabilizing. "The value of a life is not in what we have or achieve." He squeezed her hand. "It's in what we do for others, in the kind of person we are in the moments that define our character," continued Richard with conviction. "You saved me from myself, and now it's my turn to do for you what you did for me." Catherine observed him with confusion and gratitude. "It's my turn to show you that your kindness was not wasted," concluded Richard. Catherine began to cry, silent tears running down her face. "But I have no way to repay you for all this," said Catherine between tears, gesturing to the luxurious room. "I have nothing to offer you." Richard smiled through his own tears. "You've already given me everything," replied Richard. "Gave me my life back. Showed me the kind of person I want to become." He leaned forward. "But let me ask you a question," said Richard with hope. "What would you do if you could start over, have a dignified life, help other people like Gabriel and Donna Mary?" Catherine looked out the window, her gaze distant. "I've always dreamed," began Catherine hesitantly, "of having a place where I could shelter street children, give them what I couldn't give to my own child." She stopped abruptly, widening her eyes as she realized what she had revealed, bringing her hand to her mouth. Richard leaned closer, his expression changing to compassionate curiosity. "You had a child?" Richard asked gently. The pain that crossed Catherine's face answered, before any words could be spoken. Months had passed since that night at the river, that changed two lives forever. And now Catherine was standing in the garden of a light-colored house, with white details on the windows, watering the flowers she herself had planted weeks ago, and that now were beginning to bloom in vibrant colors that seemed to celebrate life itself. The morning sun bathed the yard with a golden, warm light, making the water drops shine like small diamonds when they fell from the watering can onto the petals of the flowers, and there was a gentle breeze that carried the sweet perfume of roses, mixed with the fresh aroma of newly cut grass. Catherine wore a simple but clean and well-kept dress. Her hair was tied in a loose bun, and there was a healthy color in her cheeks that wasn't there 6 months ago when she was struggling just to survive another day in the cold and unforgiving streets of the city. Suddenly, the sound of children's laughter filled the air, that kind of pure and carefree laughter that only children can produce when they are genuinely happy and safe, and Catherine turned to see Gabriel running through the yard along with 4 other children, all chasing a colorful ball that bounced unpredictably across the uneven grass. All those children had been street dwellers not long ago, each with their own sad story of abandonment and hardship. But now they had clean clothes, full bellies, and most importantly, they had a place to call home where they were loved and cared for. Catherine smiled as she watched them play, but anyone who knew her well might notice that there was something melancholic in that smile, an old sadness that never completely disappeared, no matter how happy the present might be. Her gaze drifted from the playing children and settled on a framed picture she had placed on a small table on the porch, a faded and old photo that showed a much younger Catherine, perhaps in her early 20s, holding a baby wrapped in a light blue blanket, both smiling at the camera with a happiness that seemed to come from a completely different world. "The children will devour everything before lunch," said Donna Mary, coming out of the kitchen through the back door carrying a tray full of homemade cookies still warm that exhaled a delicious aroma of cinnamon and sugar, her words carrying a tone of feigned maternal reproach that couldn't completely hide the genuine love she felt for each of those noisy children. Catherine turned to look at the older woman, who had become not just her companion but her chosen family, and smiled more genuinely this time. "Let them eat," replied Catherine, putting the watering can aside and walking toward the porch where Donna Mary had placed the tray. "They deserve all the cookies in the world, after everything they've been through." The two women stood there for a moment, side by side on the porch, watching the children play with an intensity and joy that made all the effort and all the work worthwhile. The sound of a car stopping in front of the house made both turn their heads, and Catherine felt her heart give a little leap when she saw Richard getting out of a black sedan, wearing casual clothes, very different from the elegant suits he used to wear in his previous life, carrying a leather document folder under his arm, and displaying a genuine smile that lit up his entire face in a way that definitely didn't exist 6 months ago when he was a broken man at the edge of an old bridge. "Catherine," called Richard as he walked through the small white wooden gate and up the stone path that led to the porch, his voice carrying a barely contained excitement that made his eyes shine. "I have news." Gabriel and the other children stopped playing for a moment to wave at Richard, shouting enthusiastic greetings that he returned with waves and smiles before climbing the 3 steps that led to the porch where Catherine and Donna Mary were waiting. "I'll take the cookies to the children outside," said Donna Mary with a knowing smile. Picking up the tray and going down to the yard, clearly sensing that Richard wanted to speak with Catherine privately and giving them the necessary space for that conversation. Catherine and Richard sat in two comfortable wicker chairs that she had bought at a local thrift store and restored with her own hands, and there was something familiar and comfortable about that moment, as if they had done this 1,000 times before, even though it was just one of the many conversations they had shared during those 6 months, while building something new and important together. Richard opened the document folder with movements that tried to be calm but betrayed his excitement, removing several papers organized with colorful clips and spreading them on the small table between them. "First," began Richard, taking a specific set of documents and placing them in front of Catherine, "the house." He pointed to the pages full of dense and complicated legal language that Catherine had difficulty completely deciphering. "I signed the definitive deed this morning at the registry office," explained Richard, his voice taking on a formal tone but laden with underlying emotion. "It's in your name, completely paid for, no mortgages or associated debts." He took Catherine's hand and placed it on the documents, as if making a sacred oath. "No one will ever be able to take this away from you," said Richard, and there was an intensity in his voice that showed how important this was to him, ensuring that Catherine would never again be without a roof over her head, never again be vulnerable the way she was on that terrible night in the storm. "This house is yours forever, no matter what happens." Catherine held the papers with hands that trembled slightly, her eyes scanning the words that she could barely fully understand, but whose general meaning penetrated deep into her heart in a way that made her want to cry with gratitude and relief. "Richard, I don't know how to thank you for all this," began Catherine, her voice breaking slightly with emotion, but Richard gently raised a hand to interrupt her before she could continue along that line of thought that he clearly didn't want her to follow. "It's not over," said Richard, and there was a playful gleam in his eyes now that intrigued Catherine. "There's more." He took another set of documents, these even thicker and more official looking, with seals and signatures on various pages. "Remember your dream of helping street children?" asked Richard, although he clearly didn't expect an answer because he was already continuing. "Remember what you told me that day in the hospital about wanting to give other children what you couldn't give your own child?" Catherine nodded slowly, memories of that conversation returning along with the sharp pain that always accompanied any thought about Michael, her lost baby, who would never have the chance to grow up and live the life he deserved. "I created a foundation," announced Richard, placing the documents in Catherine's hands. "A non-profit organization dedicated to helping homeless children, providing free medical care, shelter, education, everything they need." Catherine looked at the papers, seeing the official logo printed at the top, reading the words that described the mission and objectives, and feeling something big and powerful growing in her chest. "And I want to name it after your son," Richard continued, his voice softening with respect and compassion. "But only if you give me permission. Only if you feel comfortable with it." He leaned forward, establishing direct eye contact. "Tell me about him," Richard gently asked. "Tell me about Michael." Catherine closed her eyes, and when she opened them again, there were tears there. But there was also something else, a willingness to finally share that pain she had carried alone for so long, to give voice to the memory of the son who never had the chance to be remembered and honored in the way he deserved. "Michael," said Catherine, and just speaking the name aloud after so long keeping it locked inside herself was both painful and liberating. His name was Michael. He was such a beautiful and happy baby. Her voice trembled, but she continued, needing to say it, needing someone to know. "He left us because of pneumonia," Catherine continued, tears flowing freely now, but her voice remaining surprisingly steady. "Because I didn't have money to take him to the hospital, didn't have resources for the treatment that could have saved him." She looked at Richard with eyes that carried years of guilt and regret. "It was after that my husband started drinking to deal with the pain of loss," Catherine explained, each word costing a visible emotional effort. "And gradually we lost everything we had, the house, our jobs, each other, until he too was gone and I was left alone on the streets with nothing except the memory of my baby and the constant guilt of not being able to save him." The silence that followed was profound and respectful, Richard allowing those words to hang in the air between them, honoring the pain that Catherine had finally chosen to share. Richard took Catherine's hand, holding it firmly and affectionately, anchoring her in the present while she navigated through the painful memories of the past. "The Michael Foundation will ensure that no child goes through what your son went through," said Richard, and there was absolute conviction in his voice, a sacred promise being made not just to Catherine, but to the memory of a child he never knew, but who somehow changed the course of his life. "We will have shelter homes in various neighborhoods, completely free medical care available 24 hours, educational programs, psychological—" He squeezed her hand a little tighter. "And you," Richard continued, looking directly into her eyes, "you will be the director, the person who runs everything, who makes the important decisions, who ensures that the foundation always keeps its focus on the children who need it most." Catherine widened her eyes with genuine shock, clearly not expecting that. Her mouth opening but no sound coming out for a moment. "Me," she finally managed to say, her voice coming out as an incredulous whisper. "But I haven't studied, I don't have formal education, I don't know how to run an organization." Richard shook his head, a small but meaningful smile on his lips. "You know how to love," Richard replied simply. "You know how to sacrifice, you know how to see value and dignity, where others see only discards and problems." He gestured toward the yard where the children were still playing under Donna Mary's watchful eye. "You're already doing the work, Catherine," he continued. "Already saving these children, already changing lives, and that's not something you learn at any university in the world." Before Catherine could respond, Gabriel came running to the porch, his cheeks flushed from play and his eyes shining with childish excitement. "Aunt Catherine," called Gabriel, holding a piece of paper that had been folded and crumpled by the enthusiasm of his small hands, "can I show my drawing to Uncle Richard?" Catherine nodded, smiling through the tears that still glistened in her eyes, and Gabriel ran to Richard, unfolding the paper with the excessive care of someone who considers it a precious treasure. The drawing was made with crayon in vibrant colors, showing a house that was clearly the house where they were now, with a garden full of disproportionately large flowers, and various stick figures representing children and adults, all holding hands, forming a chain around the house. In the sky there was a huge sun with a smiling face, and at the bottom of the paper, in large and irregular letters written in the hesitant handwriting of a child who was just learning, was written, "My family." Richard picked up the drawing with careful hands, as if he were holding something extremely fragile and valuable, and Catherine saw when he felt a lump in his throat, his eyes becoming moist, as he observed that simple but powerful representation of what they had created together. "Can I keep this drawing?" asked Richard, his voice thick with emotion, looking at Gabriel with an expression that mixed gratitude and something approaching reverence. "It would be a great honor for me to have this." Gabriel nodded enthusiastically, his smile growing even bigger with the pride of having his artwork so appreciated. "Of course, Uncle Richard," Gabriel replied cheerfully. "I'll make an even better one for Ms. Catherine." And with that he ran back to the yard, already shouting to the other children about his next artistic project, leaving Richard and Catherine alone again on the porch. "My children called me yesterday," Richard suddenly said, still holding the drawing but looking at the horizon with a thoughtful expression. "For the first time in 6 months, they actually talked to me, instead of just responding with monosyllables or excuses to hang up quickly." Catherine looked at him with renewed attention, realizing how much that meant to him, even though he tried to appear casual when mentioning it. "They saw the report about the foundation in the newspaper," continued Richard, and now there was a small but genuine smile on his lips. "My daughter said something I will never forget." He paused, savoring the memory. "She said, 'Dad, for the first time I felt proud of you,'" repeated Richard, his voice breaking slightly. "Proud of who you are as a person." Catherine gently touched his arm. "They will come back," Catherine said with quiet conviction. "They will see that you have truly changed." Richard looked at her gratefully. "Maybe yes, maybe no," Richard replied, "and it's okay either way." He gestured around. "Family isn't just blood," he continued. "It's who stays when everything falls apart. It's who jumps into cold water for you." They stayed silent, watching the children while Ms. Mary brought more cookies. "Did you rebuild your company?" Catherine asked. Richard nodded. "Yes, but smaller, more honest," he confirmed, "and 30% of the profits go to the Michael Foundation." He paused. "Making money is easy. The hard part is gaining peace of mind." He pointed to the yard. And this piece here is priceless. Catherine finally gathered courage. Why do you do all this for me, for us, Catherine asked, when you could have gone on with your life? Richard turned to face her. Because that night when your heart stopped, Richard began, I realized something about second chances. He took her hands. Life gave me a second chance through you, Richard explained, and every second chance comes with a responsibility. Tears formed in his eyes. My responsibility is to ensure that your kindness is rewarded, he continued, that your sacrifice multiplies and touches other lives. He smiled through the tears. You taught me that true wealth isn't in what we have, said Richard, but in what we do for others, Catherine completed, smiling through tears. They embraced like true family. The scene pulled away, showing the house with flowering garden, children playing, Mrs. Mary distributing cookies, Catherine and Richard embracing on the porch, and at the entrance a sign, Michael Foundation Home, first of many. If Catherine and Richard's story moved you, don't forget to subscribe, like, and comment where you're from. And don't go anywhere. The next story is already appearing on screen, made especially for you. See you soon.